if we can flick through. And one more. Yeah, this was one question we were going to ask you, but the poll doesn't work. But I want you to think about this, right? First of all, we want to think beyond, and apologies to Cindy, but I am going to get a bit technocratic here. Yeah, I'm a consultant, that's what I do. Is that I'm going to actually think about KPIs and think about measurement, because I'm really interested in the work that we do around responsible recruitment. As we saw right at the start, there's lots of good stats on people who have policies, right? But what are you measuring? Do you find it easy to measure what you're doing as far as implementation of those policies? Right? There's no poll, but imagine there was a poll, imagine what your answer would be. I'm not going to ask you to put your hands up in the room. But then the next slide, please. I quite want you to actually just very, very briefly, what kinds of KPIs do you use to monitor the responsible recruitment practice, right? And a KPI is adopt a policy is not acceptable in these circumstances, right? Even though you might, there's a few people back there said, damn, I haven't got anything more. But that's fair, right? So while you're doing that online, anybody want to shout out a couple in the room? I'm breaking the rules here, but is that if you want to shout out to anybody, have you got a KPI to demonstrate that things are implemented in practice? Complaints? So is that, Vicky, as far as that goes, is that high complaints, low complaints? What are we looking for here, or does it not matter?
Having complaints, but seeing them go down.
Yeah. So in some ways, quite often it's good to see a big spike in complaints at the start, because that's real success. Yeah? Anybody else? Any others? No? Keep thinking about it. All right, so we're going to move over, Stephen, if you're, and keep putting them in the chat as well, and we'll come back to that later. So introduce Stephen first. I'll let him introduce himself. Okay. And with all of the speakers, just so you can know in advance the way we're going to do this, is it's a little bit different to the previous ones. They're going to have about 5 minutes, and I think each one of them has, I think, one slide. I think we gave them 1, 2 maximum slides. And they're going to tell a little bit of a story. Right? And then we're going to have a conversation about that, and then we'll move to the next and the next, and then we'll get some sort of questions from both the room and from the internet world. Okay, great. Stephen, so I'll hand over to you.
Thank you. Sorry. So my name's Stephen Slack. I work for WM Morrison Supermarkets, but in the manufacturing division of our business. We have 16 manufacturing sites across the UK. And I think we're in the top 3 for overall food production in the UK, so we're a big player in the UK market. The reason I'm here is because we had a case a few years ago at our site in Derby, which is a flour manufacturing site. We do all the bouquets for all the stores and various third-party customers. And as you can probably guess from the fact it works with flowers, it has 2 really big peaks every year. One being Valentine's Day, where everybody loves to get their roses, and the second being Mother's Day, depending on where you are, depending on what month that falls, but in the UK it's in March. And it always times it right just with the weather as well. So we love a bit of beast from the east and things when it gets to Mother's Day. This particular year though, it was the last day of production, and it was just, we was all kind of winding down and getting ready for celebrating the fact that we delivered the biggest event of the year, and getting back to normal. And I'd not been in the office too long when one of our team managers came up to me and says, I think we've got a problem. And I was like, oh right, I'm hoping that it was going to be an easy day really today. And he says, I think we've got a child in the factory. And obviously, when you have tripled your workforce over a period of sort of 7 days, you are pulling from wherever you can find that labour. So we work really well with our agencies to ensure that we get the people into the business, and they will go wherever they can to find that. And this particular person and this particular bunch of people had come from somewhere on a bus. Procedures had fallen down, and no one was on the bus to check them in that morning when they were getting on and coming to site, and ultimately someone got on that shouldn't have got on and ended up in the factory. Thankfully, our team managers and our management team had been trained on this and spotted it straight away. The concerning part of it really was that the child didn't realise she was doing anything wrong. She thought it was fine to be there. She thought she was doing someone a favour. She'd been asked just to take her place on the bus that morning, and because there was nothing on the bus and no one checking them in, they'd got to site amongst all the other 600 people that were walking at the same time, walked in and gone straight down to work in the factory. So that then obviously then snowballed, and then we had to go through what we was going to do to make sure that that young lady was protected and safe, which when we went to the AG&E initially, they just said, oh, we'll get her a taxi. And I was like, I beg your pardon, you'll get her a what?
So that was their remediation?
That was their remediation at that point. They thought they would get her a taxi. And they didn't really kind of kick into gear with thinking about what was actually the issue. It wasn't the fact that she shouldn't have been there, it was the fact that it was a child and all the rest of it. So that kicked off probably the longest day I've ever had at work, which actually ended up being 18 hours long. And we ended up having to go through the police, the GLAA, all the agencies that we have in place all supported us to be able to deal with this. The difficult thing that we found with it was the fact that none of the police actually knew what to do with the child. If it had been an adult, it would have been easier, but because it was a child, it wasn't as easy. This person had got very limited English. She was from a Romanian background, and as far as it was concerned in her community, she was just doing a favour. It also ended up nearly causing the site to lock off, because then the family and all the people that lived amongst them came to kind of get her and rescue her almost. And that's pretty much the story really, but the fact is that if we'd have got things right in the first instance, and if we'd have done the right things before that person had got to site, we wouldn't have ended up in that. The training and all the remediation that you're putting after is all very well and good, but if you don't get your first bit right, which is the recruitment, it doesn't really work. And that's where we then had to and we've spent a lot of time over the last few years making sure that all our systems and our processes are really robust to try and avoid anything like that happening again. And we do monitor them in terms of KPIs. So we monitor all our cases, and we work with various partners across the UK to make sure that we're sharing intelligence and we know what's going off, so we can avoid things becoming getting into and getting in and then having to remediate for those people. We also work with them to help people that have been victims back into work. So we do a lot to make sure that we are protected as much as we can, and then the people that are coming into the business understand properly is what they should be getting and what they should be doing. But that is pretty much what happened in Derby.
Okay, Stephen. And maybe we could go to the next slide, because I think you've got a slide that I'm glad wasn't on actually when you were talking, because I think people listen rather than read.
Yeah.
But that's some of the information. But we'll come in a minute. We'll come to what you did next and what your lessons were, which I think is really important, as you say. But just maybe to go a little bit around the incident yourself, because that's quite interesting, as you say. One is, so how old was the young person? She
was 14.
14, right? And as you say, there's all sorts of knock-ons, because probably to the agencies, oh well, it's simple. This is one incident. We'll just remove that person from the site. But you say it actually almost involved the community seeing they had to respond as well. So I mean, what did it feel like to you? Because I'm interested, as human beings, in this situation, something like that happens. We can either see it as in a technical way, but presumably that was quite challenging for you personally to have to deal with that day and subsequently as well.
Yeah, I think last time I spoke at a Stronger Together event about this, I said it was the worst day I've ever had at work, and it definitely was. And it's something that has stuck with all the people that were involved, and in fact it probably created relationships and cemented things with our agency providers, because it brought us all together. They'd never had a case like it, we'd never had a case like it. In fact, if that case hadn't happened, we probably wouldn't have tried as much as we do now to get in front of the curve.
Right.
And all the things that have come from it. We didn't even have a proper escalation policy at the time, because we'd never had it happen. So not only was it an unusual case, it was probably the first big case that we'd ever had as a business. So yeah, it did a lot to to bring us all together, and we still talk about it now in terms of the people that was involved in it. It definitely touched all of us that were involved in it.
Okay. And I think, what was the biggest thing that surprised you about, not the incident necessarily, about what happened next?
I suppose it was the fact that because it's the UK, and I can only speak for the UK, I've never worked overseas, so I suppose I never thought it was a problem here. And it brought it close to home that actually it doesn't matter where you are, that people will exploit people regardless of the nationality or country that you're in. And that's why we have to work really hard to stop that being a problem and make it, and I think someone once said it at one of these conferences, it's about being disruptive, and recruitment ultimately is the very start of where we can be disruptive and stop people being able to exploit our businesses and exploit the people that they're bringing into our business. It's really important that we make sure that we get it right from the very outset.
Okay, and then maybe I think that's a really good point actually. Let's take that disruption line, because obviously having disruptive responses is quite often different to having kind of technical or compliance responses. In fact, it's very different.
Yeah.
Can you think of something that you think you've done that is potentially disruptive afterwards?
I think the biggest thing is the amount of stuff we translate and the amount of information that they get from the very outset. There's been lots of people today talk about making sure that there's the apps to tell the employees what they're going to get when they start with you and all that, but it's making sure that they actually truly understand it. And that's the difference. We now make sure that anybody coming in our business can get a contract translated into their own language, where because we were in the UK, you kind of almost think, well, they're here, so that's the way it is, that's the contract, that's what they've got. So we got it translated into as many different languages as we need. We ensure that from the outset that they understand what it is that they're going to get and when to expect it and what it is that we're going to do and what we're going to give them, and what the expectation is from their outside of work life as well. Because if they know that, no one can then pull the wool over their eyes to be able to deceive them into what they should be bringing home. Okay,
so that's about also improving your communication with the workforce.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what about the agency? What's changed with your relationship with either with that agencies or agencies in general?
So to be fair, we still use that agency, and we've gone into another contract with them because actually I believe that their systems and their processes are actually really robust. They work with us on preemptive stuff as well, so they share intelligence that they get and they work with us to make sure that we're up to date with the things that they're finding in their business. So we can check our systems and we can then look into it as well. So it means that we're working really, really collaboratively together to ensure that we're, again, trying to stop anybody infiltrating the business.
Okay. And just one final question, and Sonia, I'll come to you in one second. I know you're waiting patiently, but if you had, we all like time travel movies. My particular favourite is Bill and Ted, obviously. But if you could go back in time, a year before the incident, what one thing would you do a year before the incident?
I think it's to make sure that you're asking the right questions. I assumed our agency had it all in hand in that circumstance, but like us, they're dealing with something that's abnormal to them in that circumstance. And why I thought they had everything closed off and bottomed out, they didn't. And actually, if you've got to ask those difficult questions, even if you think they've got it covered, and it might be something simple, ask it, making sure that you've covered everything off. Cover those bases 100% of the time, in fact 120% of the time.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
And I think it's really good. One of the questions I saw earlier, I think, online, and it wasn't, I mean, Bonnie's picking lots of sort of things, was about the role of HR and why isn't HR more visible? I mean, I think it's great to have Stephen here, because to have actually HR here to talk about what it feels like to manage it, rather than, many of us sit at slightly abstract level sometimes on these things, yeah? So that's really great. Thank you very much. You can have a little clap, actually, I think. Now, sort of segueing on from that, I'm going to go to Sonia, who's based in Murcia in Spain, and she's going to talk actually about supervisors. So, you know, a segue on from this to talk about the role of supervisors in this. So, Sonia, you're hopefully going to come online on the big screen soon. And certainly your slides are there if you're not. I can see you down on this screen anyway. So, Sonia, if you want to kick off just to explain, you know, what you do and what your role is, and just some of the lessons that you got working with G's, which G's will be known to lots of people and lots of the great work that they do in this field and in fields, as far as actually working on responsible recruitment issues with supervisors in the very specific context that you have in sort of eastern and southern Spain.
Spain. I'm from the ethical compliance team here, and my work is to verify workers' condition, do internal audits, to supervise our supply chain, and one of our bases is to do training on workers' recruitment, and it's what I'm going to explain here today.
Great. Okay, so if you want to just sort of kick off, if you want to walk through, I think you've got a slide as well. So
yes,
if we can
only
sort of
one,
click
actually.
to the next slide to work through what kind of things you've been working with on supervisors to embed your sort of principles and your approaches as a company as far as responsible recruitment practice, and what kind of impacts those have had as well.
Okay, we based our training responsible recruitment in step 3 and 4 that you will see in the slides. That it's on local recruiters, applicants, and on interviews. So the basis on the training is to recognize modern slavery signs and difference with labor exploitation. And this is so important because we focus our training on being able, so the person that we've got in front understands what is modern slavery and the difference between modern exploitation. Of course, in the onboarding with the workers, once they are hired, they also have another training related with this. But in this case, it's only with responsible recruitment. We teach them on our ethical commitments in our ethical trade policy, and we focus this training in the areas of major risk. Which are the areas of major risk? Discrimination, not to discriminate anyone on the interviews, to be able to detect vulnerable workers who are the ones on risk to have their rights breached, to detect identity documents and to detect those who are false, to detect in this recruitment process if workers are paying for any service to an intermediary or someone in the company. In this case, we register all the intermediaries. Also, to be aware of language. So, in case workers are coming and they are not speaking in the language of the interviewer, we always train them that they need to look for someone to translate, never someone who has bring those workers. And we focus also in that they need to understand that modern slavery and labor exploitation can happen in this company. So in this case, we teach them in yellow flags how to raise yellow flags and to use the whistleblowing channel. And one of the most important things is to train all workers and also recruiters on which are workers' rights. So from my work, I think that the benefits of this training is that these practices are monitored. This means that if someone in the company thinks that they can breach the law or they can have a look for money to bring workers to our company, if we teach them that from, in this case, yes, we are having a look to those issues, maybe this will stop them. Then we empower team leaders in good ethical practice, and we make them to have teams that trust in their work. they understood workers' rights and we empowered them to follow the workers' rights. Then they offer confidence on their teams, and we offer them also interview skills, so they are able to detect identity theft, monitoring who brings workers, tips to recognize false documents. And another good practice is to include in the job description of these recruiters to be a recruiter as part of their job role. So the company is paying them. Then we teach them on yellow flags. Once they are hired, they continue reporting if one of the workers in the interview, they have suspects of something not being well. So they continue using the whistleblowing channel to raise yellow flags.
Okay, great. I mean, that's all sort of very broad and very impressive. I'm going to ask you a question directly of, how successful do you think it is, and what are the challenges for the supervisors once they've received, this training and the support that you give them? When does it work and when doesn't it work?
Well, I think it works, this training works very well, and actually people who receive the training, they get surprised. How can someone of your same nationality can earn money for a vulnerable worker? Mm-hmm. And the major problem that from all these years is that I have listened so many times saying a co-worker that maybe has came with another person with false documents is saying that I was doing a favor. Mm. So they are not thinking that that is bad and the implications of doing that, and that maybe someone can help in that situation. So we need to build trust from workers, supervisors, and company to be able to control all this industry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. That's a common factor already between there. That the thing straight back was I was doing somebody a favour. And obviously looking beyond that is really super important to get what's really happening there. And I think, are there ways, as far as the supervisor is concerned, because you can either see the supervisor as a problem or a solution, and I think you're looking at them as a solution here, which is great, but what can you do to have them sort of play an even stronger role? And how do you also call out supervisors who are particularly good at this and get them to mentor or support other people, or people have a particularly strong moral view?
Yes, the problem are with the new ones that are no more used to this training, but the ones who are with us for so many years, they understand that they've got an ethical team that when they are seeing any sign of modern slavery or labor exploitation, they are calling us, and I think that is our win. Having people consulting us before doing anything.
Okay, great. And one final question, and then we'll go sort of straight down the date line to Johannesburg. And it's maybe a question for you to think about, Stephen, as well, and probably Evan as well. But I think, in all three countries, UK, Spain, and South Africa, there are lots of commonalities here as far as labour markets, migrant workers, elections. South Africa's just come out of a very sort of fractious election. UK's just going into an election, I believe. And Spain seems to have been in elections almost constantly for the last 3 years. Yeah. And one issue there is obviously political narratives around migrants from certain parts of the political spectrum. And I know in Spain, obviously, from some of the right parties, there is a very defined narrative around migrants. How do you work around that to actually work on the point that I think a few people have made previously? We're talking about human beings here. And how do you actually use this to kind of better humanise actually your colleagues who may not be, from Spain originally?
That is a very good question, and it's so difficult to answer, because our situation in Spain is that every day people think that immigration is coming to Spain, in this case, in a bad way. And what people in agriculture companies are saying is that this is people that wants to work, and we need to put them things easier to work here in Spain. And the thing is that politicians are not letting us have a good way to hire them or to bring workers out from Spain to be able to work here, because Spanish people do not want to work in agriculture. So we need workers, and we need to empower their rights and to let them work.
Okay, good. And we'll perhaps come back to that, because it's a very similar narrative that I think probably hasn't been heard enough during the selection campaign, actually. There are other narratives we hear. So going to go to Evan now. Is obviously, like I said, as far as South Africa is concerned, and if you can explain to us a little bit, Evan is the Africa Programme Manager of Stronger Together, will be known to some, maybe many of you. And I think if you can just actually start by explaining a little bit of what the context and the situation is in South Africa, and I know you've got a couple of slides as well, particularly in the relation to the role that migrant workers play in South Africa, but also some of the challenges you see around responsible recruitment issues.
Yeah, just to give an overview, I think South Africa very similar to the previous two speakers. One thing about South Africa is that we have a long history of cheap and exploitable labor, particularly in high labor-intensive industries, which sort of form the foundation of modern South Africa. Within agriculture specifically, there's a prevalence of antiquate labor practices, which present significant risks, particularly when it comes to recruitment. And if I can ask, just for the first slide, I can just give an overview of sort of what I see on the ground and sort of where businesses in the agri space, how they do recruitment. I think what is important is that, to mention right at the beginning, is that recruitment is not homogeneous. It differs from one area to the other, depending on where business is located. But generally speaking, you either do sort of internal recruitment or external recruitment. And in both cases, there are significant risks. So internally, it will be the agribusiness, the owner, the farm managers, or HR that would recruit. One could also add supervisors there that would recruit workers. In other cases, one could outsource labor to labor contractors, or as we refer to them in South Africa as temporary employment services. These are oftentimes not well-regulated businesses. They operate very informally. And in some very remote areas, it's not uncommon for businesses to engage local tribal leaders to access labor from local communities. And each of these cases, it presents significant risks to a business. And so the message that we always say is that, regardless of what recruitment model you operate, one needs to be aware of the risks associated with that. Added to that, and we can perhaps go to the next slide, is sort of the broader context in which recruitment happens. I think to link on to your last question, Steve, around sort of the broader socio-political context, one needs to understand that businesses don't operate in a bubble. So again, South Africa, we've got a history of migration, both internally, within provinces, but also across borders, where workers historically would look for work in sectors like mining and agriculture. And these cross-border movements presents at times quite a big risk, because we have very porous borders in South Africa, both land as well as sea borders, and those migrant corridors are often hotbeds for exploitation from recruiters or transporters who receive potential workers into paying recruitment fees or lying about potential what the actual jobs entail. You also have issues with irregular migrants, or as we more generally understand them, undocumented foreigners. In South Africa, we've seen quite a lot of fraudulent work papers. So linking up with Sonia said, I think I sympathize with a lot of business where you have all these processes in place, but fraudulent papers and how people pay either local South Africans to use ID documents, or they forge documents that look very legitimate. And if you are not well trained to spot fraudulent papers, you could put your business at risk. And then there's also the broader issues around criminal syndicates that operate through these fraudulent schemes as well. At a policy level, within agriculture, one has seen corporate work permits become extremely challenging to acquire. So historically in South Africa, particularly during peak harvest season, it's not uncommon that some businesses would have been exempted from employing migrant labor from neighboring countries. There was a policy agreement in place at a national level. But over the years, we've seen, given South Africa's challenge with unemployment and poverty, there's sort of it's become more challenging to acquire these work permits as government is trying to push for more local employment. But in areas where it's difficult for business to access local labor, there is a necessity to use migrant labor in various sorts. And I think that unethical recruitment can happen at various stages within the recruitment process, from pre-selection, during the employment, as well as post-termination. And it's important that businesses are aware of these risks that might present itself. Just a few examples on the screen. We had a case last year within the agriculture sector where a farm owner, his son, and his two supervisors were recruiting women and children from Mozambique to work in one of the provinces. This is currently a case before the courts on charges of people smuggling and human trafficking. The workers were not eligible to work. And in many instances, they were deceived about the conditions under which they arrived at the farm as well. So, unfortunately, it is a reality that can happen within our space as well.
Okay, that's super useful, and I'm just going to sort of unpack that a little bit in a minute as far as documentation and legal pathways to employment. But just open it perhaps with a broad sort of question to you, Evan. I mean, as far as working on responsible recruitment, which obviously you do, from Stronger Together and all the great work that Stronger Together does, what do you think the biggest challenges are? If I said, what are the two biggest challenges in actually making progress in this area, what are they for you personally?
Yeah, I think, and again, this one probably, Stephen, it extends beyond just businesses. I think if you look at the labor migration process, it can be quite long and complex. And because of this complexity at times and sort of the challenges it is to legally acquire eligibility to work, can lead to instances where we take the shortcut in many instances. There's also issues around migrant corridors that I mentioned previously, where there are certain notorious areas in South Africa along our borders where people are preyed on through vulnerability and desperation. So given these the assumption that South Africa is seen as a land where people can acquire work or acquire jobs, but we are dealing with significant challenges of our own, and so when people are desperate for work, they will agree to work under any conditions for any amounts of pay. So I think there's the legal side and supporting businesses that want to do the right thing. I'm talking about issues around corporate work permits as well, And that's, they really need assistance from sort of your broader government departments. I also think another challenge is that sort of when you are entering low-wage occupation, it can become quite difficult or easy to get into debt, which makes it challenging for that employment to help in terms of upward mobility, right? So a lot of the times I hear, that businesses, they have good processes in place, they've got policies, they do their due diligence, but they're not always aware of, potentially workers having to pay a transporter exorbitant amounts of money to cross the border to enter South Africa, and also where to then, seek assistance. So then it becomes a vicious cycle where that employment is just enough to pay off debts that they might have, and in that way doesn't really contribute in a meaningful way.
Okay, that's great. And one final thing, and then we'll just move to a sort of more general conversation. Can you think of any specific sort of good practices that you've seen from businesses in South Africa and Southern Africa? And particularly if you can bring out things just with your experience that are a bit unique, if there's anything or innovative that you've seen people do.
Yeah, I think from the work that we've done, the agriculture specifically, there's been a lot of good work. I think a lot of companies are committed to ensuring that workers don't pay recruitment fees, that they properly onboarded. So recruitment is never just a one person's responsibility. A lot of the businesses, they're using teams and sort of managers, supervisors, but also having a follow-up through extensive inductions, making sure that the business's positions explained to them. But I think one thing I found very encouraging with a lot of our businesses is when they're employing migrant or temporary or seasonal work during harvest season. It's sort of a 3, 6, 9 month employment in the year. It's how do we create a sustainable model in which those workers consistently have work every season. So instead of going through the extensive process of trying to recruit people again or recruit new people, many businesses would detailed labor records of previous employees that worked at the farm, that worked within the companies, within the pack houses. And they would often use that as a means to acquire labor again for the following season. And a lot of the times, workers would know that come a particular point in the year, there is regular work at this specific site. And that sort of provides a sense of sustainability and security for businesses. Also added to that is that a lot of businesses are talking to one another. So when it's not their peak season, they are referring seasonal temporary workers to different sites where they can receive another period of employment. And I think that for me is really important because it reduces vulnerabilities and risks. So workers don't have to work or not have work for 6 months of the year, which only heightens vulnerability. So that consistent work is definitely a positive that I've seen in our agriculture space.
Okay, that's really good. And actually, I want to bring that out to you, Stephen, and to Sonia as well. So I think there's that sort of drawing a couple of things out from some of that conversation, I think, is that the idea of consistency, the idea of certainty, and also the idea of legality, comes through a number of those, that if actually you can have workers who are legal, and that's about government, and government actually sort of make it easier to be legal sometimes, I think, but also have some certainty about where they're working and consistency. That kind of works for workers and it works for employers as well. Now, how do you see it in the UK in the current situation? Because obviously there's been a couple of quite significant shocks to the UK labour market in the last 6 years, I think, and we all know what those are. But I mean, how has that impacted on you as far as working as an HR people person in where you get your workers from? And are there things you think that government could do better? We've got an election next week to actually make it easier for you to recruit people ethically and legally. Just a small question, yeah.
So to be fair, since COVID and the, I don't want to say it was a recession because I don't think they kind of declined that fact on me. It's not a recession. Labour's been easier to find.
Right.
We've not struggled as much as we thought we probably would do over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. I think we're not quick enough at granting visas to migrants as they come in that want to work, and we could do far better with that than we currently do. I think we should be granting more of the visas that allow you to come in for unskilled work instead of it being as specific as it has been around specific industries like the meat industry and things like that, because I do think businesses are still crying out for it. And we are seen as a country where people want to come and work, and we could do so much more to help with that. And I think the fact that we have made it harder is allowing, again, so you look at the settled status scheme that we rolled out after Brexit, there still doesn't seem to be a clear monitoring process for pre-settled status, if you've gone home, if you've come back. There is so much more we need to do to get to grips with it, and I think from speaking to some of the agencies, they are using the pre-settled status and the settled status schemes to go in and recruit back in Europe, which again leaves us probably open to exploitation and then people not doing the right thing. So we probably should do way more with and have some more rules around that, I would think, and some more legislation. They don't seem to be very forthcoming at the minute with the settled status, what's going to happen with it. Because if you're employed, you're fine. If you're not employed, you have to prove it. But if you then go home, you can, and then decide to come back, it kind of puts you in a position to get back in with the wrong people.
Okay. And Sonia, for you, as far as Spain is concerned, I'm asking this because you mentioned also the point of the difficulty in getting sort of, if you like, risk-free, and that's risk to you, but particularly risk to workers, of actually sort of pathways to employment and legal employment. Do you think either Madrid government or regional governments are open to what you need, and do you think they support what you need in terms of either visa and pathways to legal employment?
Well, we will take into the point that they will need to do something, because otherwise we won't have workers to harvest our products. So in that point, I think they are starting to put measures from the central government, but in the cases of the regions where they are not the socialists, it's been harder.
Yeah, okay. We'll go to look at perhaps some of the online questions now, but while you're coming up, I'll just mention for those of you who are from or live in the UK, is that on the sort of the skills sort of visa point, I think there was a very good point on the radio. There was a farmer on the radio last week which made the really strong point, the concept that going and working really hard all day in difficult conditions is not a skill, right? It's not a skill I possess, right? And I think it is a skill, and actually we should be able to. There's really something quite nasty about actually that distinction of skill and not skill in this context and how we define it.
And then salary expectations,
yes,
all then restricts it even further.
Exactly. Bonnie.
All right. Hi, Steve. So I'm going to ask this question in terms of a story.
Okay.
So this came from earlier, and I think it's perfect for this panel on practical realities. So you're an employer in a country with job mobility. Mm-hmm. Or as the person who asked this question said, visa portability, different terms. It's a key right for migrants, and it's something that we advocate, where they're not tied to the sponsor of their visa. So in some countries, in some contexts with this, perhaps the employer is more hesitant about paying the cost of travel and recruitment if they are not sure the worker would stay and they would see their investment collapse. So can you talk a little bit about perhaps solutions you've seen that could mitigate some of these risks and safeguard company investments? Yeah, is that, do you have time for another one? Or is that enough of a story to get us started?
Let's start with that one and
Okay.
throw it around the panel and then come back through. So perhaps I'm going to start with you, Evan, actually. So perhaps if I summarise to get it right on here, so you're an employer, you know the employer pays principles, you know that you should be paying the fees, that workers shouldn't be paying the fees, but you see that as a cost and an investment. And I think particularly in kafala type environments, then we've heard that a lot. I can't transition because the workers will disappear and it's a waste of my investment, is what you hear, yeah? So, Evan, what about that? What do you do with employers? And obviously you work with a lot of employers and with other agencies to convince the employer, it's the right thing to do, but also it's a commercial sensible thing to do to be paying for recruitment and not to have workers paying for fees.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely challenging one. We don't come across that quite a lot in South Africa, but we have had instances where companies invest in the development of their staff through work schemes and bursaries and the likes, and then there's sort of this expectation that those skills would then benefit the company, and then what happens in instances where they perhaps end up leaving or do not study something that might be beneficial to the company. I think having clear communications around what is expected and being open and transparent in that recruitment process is very important. So you make it clear from the beginning the expectations on both sides, from the employee side as well as those seeking employment as well. And then having clear guidelines in terms of when recruitment fees are paid, that workers or job seekers understand that it's not just that there is a cost involved in this process. So for me, that would be a good starting point is having open and transparent conversations around costing and the cost associated with recruitment with potential job seekers.
Okay. Well, I mean, Stephen, it might be with this group, I'm just thinking whether that's, the scenario might be a little bit not there, but I'm going to ask, have you had instances where you've found that there's recruitment fees being paid and you've stepped in to either repay or deal with that?
Not specifically. We did do some overseas recruitment probably about 2 years ago now with the meat visas, because we have 3 meat sites within the manufacturing business. And what I can say is we paid for everything. So
right.
we covered all the costs of the travel, the accommodation, all that kind of stuff. We did the right thing. I think if you are an employer and you're frightened that then your investment's going to leave, do better.
Be a better employer.
Is that?
Yeah.
To me, if you treat them with the respect that they deserve,
yeah.
and make them welcome and do all the right stuff, your investment's not going to walk off, is it? So that would be my advice. Do better.
Yeah. Simple. Very good.
Thank you. So we have another question, and it's going back to what you said about if you could go back in time. So this question, plays on that. So Stephen, if you could go back in time and the child in question was not alone, but rather she's at the factory with her parents, would you have done things differently? And if so, what would it have been? And then we have the last question for Sonia, which is, what can we do to help you in your work? What do you need? How can we spotlight what you're doing, given the fact it's a sector of work that most Spanish people, from your description, don't seem to care very much about? So we'll leave it with that, yeah?
Great questions. Thank you, the internet.
Me?
Yeah.
The answer is no. Her mum did come for her as part of the day. And ultimately, we did find out that the police ended up putting her back with the parents. But for me, we did everything that we should do to protect that child. She had a right to education, she had a right not to be working, she had all the rights that any other child should have. So, no, I wouldn't change anything. If anything, I'm upset that the system failed and then didn't help her to find the support that she needed to escape the situation she was in.
And Sonia, what do you need? What could help you?
I'm also open to suggestions. This is a value added to every company who is looking for ethics and looking for workers' rights. So what we need is that internally and externally to have our work recognized and to be happy of those companies that have an ethical team that are aware of human rights.
Great, and I think, sharing here, I mean, all of the sharing that's happening in these 2 days is really important to actually sort of deal with that as well. So I'm going to break with the rules now because we missed out our polling, which was great because we've got 5 minutes more. So I'm going to just actually ask to the room as well. You can ask questions with your voices, yeah, rather than your thumbs. Yeah. So any questions from the room? You weren't planning for that, were you? No?
We still have questions.
Oh, you still got them online, have you?
I think it's hard for people to ask without the mic.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I think we'd rather have them online.
Yeah.
Okay. So this question's about piecework.
Yeah.
Does the practice of having piecework, does it incentivize exploitation in a way? Does it act as an incentive to hide exploitation?
Okay. Yeah. So the question for piecework, and just checking, okay, for Evan and Sonia, you know what we're meaning when we're meaning piecework? Yeah, great. So do you have piecework? Question one. And if so, do you think it incentivizes exploitation? It's a question to all three of you.
We do, but it's on top of minimum wage, so it's different over here. In terms of it's not their sole wage. They have to be paid minimum wage and then they earn on top. And it only happens in one of our sites. And it's to do with an industry practice in fish. So, and it's to do with shelling, I believe. It's not something I'm very familiar with, but yes, it does. And I don't believe it does. I think if you do it right and you've got the right base level, it shouldn't incentivise it now.
But do you have any different levels of either risk assessment or monitoring where you have piecework with that in mind?
No, I don't believe we do, so it's probably one to look at.
Okay. Sonia, what about you? Do you have piecework and payment per produce or kilogram?
Yes, but here in Spain, to pay only through piece rate is illegally. You need to maintain working hours and you need to pay a piece rate as an extra.
Okay, so it's on top of the minimum wage that you pay already, yes?
Yes,
Okay.
we are paying working hours
do we
and
see
then
the piece
the
rates?
piece
What
rate.
role does it play and does it drive exploitation?
Yeah, so I think very similar to Stephen's point. So it's not sometimes in some areas piecework is used, but with a lot of the industry bodies that we work with and sort of the guidelines around piecework, it's over and above the minimum wage. So businesses should not be using it as a way to underpay employees. So having that as sort of as a practice, but still complying to sort of basic labor laws and giving business guidance around that as well. I think it does present a challenge at times, particularly in South Africa, but I think globally as well, that labor has become more expensive, and so you sort of cut back on working hours, shifts, employment periods, and or using piecework as a way of incentivizing workers to produce. But I think there's quite clear guidelines in South Africa that over and above basic minimum wage is a minimum threshold.
Great. Thanks very much. I think I'm going to sort of round it up there and thank all of the speakers, on my behalf and your behalf as well, because I think it's really useful to have this sort of, deep dive into the practicalities. And there's a couple of things I think come from the conversations. And one of the ones I think generally, I think, and particularly seen from yours as well, is just let's not forget how important it is to have escalation routes and safeguarding routes, because we can talk a lot about risk and prediction and processes. But when we have critical instances like this, we owe it to human beings to be able to respond quickly or to get them to people who can actually respond to them quickly. And I think that's something as well that you said, Sonia, with the yellow flags is, you raise the yellow flags, but then you need to do something, yeah? And particularly when the red flags are there. So feel free, obviously, to reach out sort of in relation to Sonia and Evan separately to continue conversations, and also recommend as well for those of you sort of in the room over coffee, unless you have to run away early, to speak to Stephen as well. So thank you for all the questions that came in, and thank you for a great session. And thank you to the guys in the back behind the glass. As I was sort of pointing higher and higher, they did their best to actually get the sound as we got it here, and I know it's not ideal. Thanks very much, everyone.